Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Here we are yet again with another One Piece at a Time talking head video, this time with some questions though. So this one is from Dean. Hi, I appreciate your YouTube channel and answering questions. I have searched the internet and have not found any information. I have found that I get much less starch converted using cracked corn over flake corn. My gravity reading therefore is less than 10%, typically at 7%, at 0.56 to 0.60. I see that many online videos just add sugar to their wash to get their ABV range to 9 to 11%. I've found that adding the sugar has caused my fermentation to be very slow, or it will stop at around 1.020 gravity and tough to get restarted. To combat this, I do not add any sugar at the beginning of my grain wash. I toss my yeast in with my all-grain wash. Then after a day, when the yeast are actively rolling, I start adding 10 pounds of sugar each day or so to ensure my yeast are eating well and don't get stressed. This typically results in my yeast going into a frenzy of eating. Have you ever tested adding sugar a day after fermentation has been started? Do you think this process changes the flavor? I'd appreciate any other thoughts about spiking the grain wash with sugar after starting the fermentation. Note, I use two 25-watt fish aquarium heaters in my 30-gallon barrels to keep my mash at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Dean, great questions here. So, you're definitely going to get better conversion initially from flake corn, especially if you're not using exogenous enzymes, if you're relying on barley in particular. Very few barley malts have the actual beta amylase to be able to fully convert a mash or a wash. A lot of times they will stall out at 10-10, 10-15, somewhere in that range. That's pretty normal, and that's what was going on pre-prohibition. If you are using exogenous enzymes, I'm surprised that you're not getting full conversion, other than the fact that you said you're using cracked corn. So if it's cracked, of course, there's less surface area for the various enzymes as well as the yeast to work at that piece of corn. So the smaller, the finer milled it is, the more they're going to be able to break it down and get all those good things out of it for sure. You know, I'm not sure. A lot of people seem to want to go for these higher gravity readings of like, 10, 11, 12%. I mean, it's fully up to you guys, but the one thing I will tell you is you get up around 10, 11, 12%, you're not going to find a lot of professional distillers that do that because the flavor just doesn't work the same. Once you're past that threshold of 7 to 10% at the most, you're getting into really just pushing alcohol for the sake of alcohol. It's also raising your proof during your distillation run. And it throws a lot of monkey wrenches into the flavor profile. So always bear that in mind. That's just also my personal opinion and a thing that I've experienced very much so. Now, that being said, this idea of adding sugar the day after fermentation and adding 10 pounds a day, that's a very old idea. You'll actually find that in the old Foxfire book, where they talk about basically making a malted corn whiskey that's an all grain, but it's a real thin wash. And in the day of, they'll add 10 pounds of sugar if they're going to add it. After that begins to ferment and gets most of the way through, maybe 3 days out, then they would add another 40 pounds of sugar to a 50-gallon barrel, right? And raise their gravity that way. What happens when you add sugar to the barrel is you're dealing with sucrose. You're also dealing with higher gravities, both of which are pretty hard on yeast. Yeast isn't really primed to eat sucrose. It really wants that sugar broken down, which is why we oftentimes invert sugar. It allows the yeast to work through it a little easier and to metabolize it a little easier. And it also, in my opinion, leads to a better quality of liquor coming off of the still. You get less of that quote-unquote sugar bowl effect that Jesse's often talked about on Still It. But what you're talking about here, where you're doing basically a safety net mash, you're doing it exactly the way I would do it. You're making your all grain and then feeding it a little bit of sugar, maybe 10 pounds the next day after fermentation kicks off with your all grain, and then 10 pounds after that. That's exactly what I do. It's almost like step feeding nutrient, except it's not nutrient. It's actual food that they're eating and converting, right? One of the reasons that sugar fermentations go slow is because the yeast do have a very hard time metabolizing that sucrose. They will still go slow even if you invert the sugar, but it's by far faster than if you do not invert the sugar, in my experience, as long as you're controlling your temperatures. They don't like the osmotic pressure of that sugar. They don't like that particular sugar molecule, that sucrose molecule that's being fed to them. And so that does slow them down very, very, very substantially. So you're right on here, and that is a great method for sure. I have done that quite often. Do I think the process changes the flavor? So even when I do that, most often I'm inverting that sugar. Not always, but most often. I suspect that because you're not overstressing those yeast all at once with that osmotic pressure, you're probably getting at least a little, and I hate this word, but a little smoother liquor, a liquor with maybe a little less heat to it, a little less bite to it, as it were. I don't know if the majority of people would catch that tasting it, or if that's just a distiller thing that's very particular to the fact that we distill, right? And so because we're exposed to it, we certainly pick up on things that a lot of consumers might not pick up on. Appreciate any other thoughts about spiking the grain wash with sugar after starting the fermentation? I really don't have a whole lot. I will tell you this. There is a great yeast out there that you guys should look into. It's made by LD Carlson. It's called Firm Fast, and it's a type of turbo yeast, but using amino acids instead of DAP. And they do make them for rum, and they make them for grain as well. If you want to speed your fermentations on a little bit, and it is an expensive yeast, but it's an all-in-one package. It's really a turbo yeast, but it does not taste like a turbo yeast. But that stuff, every time I've played with it, man, no matter what I've thrown into that fermentation, you throw it in there and you throw a little space heater on a 30-gallon barrel, within 3 days, done, period, end of story, over with. So think about that when you're doing these mixed media washes and mashes, as it were, these safety net washes and mashes. That might be something that you may want to look into. So see if I can find us another question here. I printed off a bunch of papers and I got busy with other outside things this week, and I don't know where I put all of them at, so I'm still trying to figure out what I actually have and what I don't have. So let me see, maybe one more here. All right, so from Floyd, Alan, I have 2 stills, both stainless. Recently I used my air still with a newly acquired copper parrot. During my stripping run, I noticed how smooth it was at 50% ABV. Was it the copper or the parrot blending the liquor? For your information, the mash I tried to spin, I tried my spin on your absinthe recipe you gave still it. The recipe I used, ingredients I had on hand: oats 8 ounces, raisins 8 ounces, malted white wheat 10 ounces, dark brown sugar 32 ounces, rum yeast 1 teaspoon, and 2.5 gallons of water. On the spirit run, I'm thinking of macerating a half cup of raisins for 24 hours in the low ones. As always, I enjoy your show and alchemy. Hey, that reminds me, there was another question. I'll have to see if I can find it here in a minute, but I have another question that goes along with this. Anyways, so you're basically asking if the copper in the parrot, or the blending of the parrot, was maybe what made that particular product so smooth. That's an interesting question. So copper can have an effect on spirits post-distillation in the same way that it can on wine. Specifically, if there are sulfates at all involved, the copper can absorb some of that and clean it up a little bit. But I suspect that it has a lot to do with that particular mash bill, which is a very kind of smooth, almost neutral mash bill in the first place. You're probably getting some small amount of secondary effect off of that copper parrot if you're doing an all stainless steel run, but I don't think it's a whole lot. I think that there's a lot to be said here for that mash bill, but you're also your distilling equipment and your methods of distillation when it comes to the quality. That's probably changed things up quite a bit for you, would be my guess. The only place where I would tend to see, where I would expect to see that copper parrot have any real effect on the flavor of any sort of spirit would be in the case of a wine that's been heavily sulfited, being distilled, and even then trying to clean that up's pretty rough. Or maybe even on some single malt stuff, if it was run off at a higher temperature, you might get some interaction that might clean up some of the proteins and things of that nature. Not proteins, I'm sorry, but some of the after effects of those proteins, especially nitrogen coming across. You might get a little bit of effect there. It sounds like you've got a really cool idea there of macerating a half cup of raisins for 24 hours in the low ones before redistilling. So that leads me to the next question that somebody had, and I don't know where that paper is, but I remember the question roughly. Let me comment on this half cup of raisins for 24 hours in the low ones. I think you're going to be surprised how much flavor that pulls and how much like a brandy that spirit will drink once you do this. Make sure you squeeze those raisins out to the best of your ability, or if you've got a gin basket, throw those raisins into a gin basket and strip that alcohol back out of them, one way, shape, form, or the other. There's also going to be a lot of flavor in those raisins even after you do that. So that's exactly how a Geist or various different, very volatile brandies are made. I've talked about this on the channel before. Something like blackberry or raspberry or strawberry. Instead of trying to ferment those things that are very volatile and it's very hard to capture their flavor anyways, you're much better to make a low wine or even a high wine. So a finished spirit at 135, then proof it back down to 80, and then macerate your berries at about 2 pounds per gallon in that liquid before redistilling for about 24 hours. You'll be surprised how much fruit flavor you pull off of it. That truly is what's called a ghost or a geist. It is a type of brandy, even if the base alcohol is made of grain spirits or whatever it's made out of. But it makes for some very interesting products, and I've had a lot of great luck with it. We actually did at my distillery we call it an eau de vie. That's not really a proper name for it, but that is the fanciful name that we used. But it is a blackberry geist is what it is. Literally 2 pounds per gallon into neutral grain spirits for 24 hours, 1 hour of which at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and then redistilled, and we pulled all that nice blackberry fruit flavor plus that phenolic flavor from the seeds across, and it was absolutely gorgeous. So let me see, maybe I have one more I can get through in the same video. That would actually be kind of nice. So this one is clearing a wash. How important is it? From Jeffrey. So recently fermented a corn, rice, and an oat project that I plan to turn into something pretty neutral. In the past, I normally would have pulled some clearish liquid off the top and stripped that, and as was running, I would go through the painful process of skimming and squeezing, but not this time. I just grabbed all the wash I could and left it in the garage. Getting ready to run, it was crystal clear. Is there a benefit to doing this? I know people run on grain, so I'm guessing no, but I have no clue. Question 2, how much should I expect to lose to the grain and liquid from mashing in? I started with 104 pounds of grain, 51 rice, 48 corn, 5 oats, and 47 gallons of liquid, 42 water, 5 back set to lower the pH. Everything squeezed out. I have 41 gallons of milky mess, Lord knows how much trub. Is this good? Is there something I can do to improve it? Thank you as always for your knowledge. So some people swear by clearing their wash and others do not. You run into this even in Scotland with single malt. Some of the distilleries let that wash clear to some degree. Some run it cloudy. What I will tell you is the more of that original mash that you can get into the still, without having to worry about scorching the bottom of the still if you're running on open flame or scorching your elements, the better. If I were running an electric still with elements, I probably would completely clear every bit of wash I have as though I was making wine. Because that's where you really got to be concerned about those elements scorching those particulates, especially those yeast cells, onto the elements. Now, with a fire bottom still, you can still scorch a wash that has some amount of that cloudiness or that turbidity in it. But if you go slow on your heat up and you take some time and every once in a while you actually stir that wash that's in your still, I've never had one scorch. The only time I've ever scorched is when I've been in a hurry or been doing something stupid or been experimenting with something. In cognac production, the most valued brandy that you produce is actually the Lees brandy part of cognac. And that is, and this is the same for Calvados as well, that is all of the wine at the bottom of the fermentation tank that has all of that trub, all those yeast cells left in it. That is the richest brandy that you will make. Those are sort of the treasured brandies that are going to go in for long aging into barrels, because a lot of flavor comes out of that. The same is true for bourbon. We distill on the grain for bourbon. We distill on the grain for rye. It's not normal, but we actually distill on the grain for single malt whiskeys. The reason for that is because we want to pull all of that flavor from those grains that we possibly can for a big, bold, heavy-duty spirit that we can cut the way that we want and then mature the way that we want. It's much easier for us to try to take out flavors as we go than it is to try to add flavors back in, as it were. So I like to start with a wide palette of flavor, and having those solids and those yeast cells and that trub and everything else in there allows me to have that wide swath of flavor to choose from during the distillation. Now, if I was just making white spirits, and specifically if I was making white spirits bumped with sugar or anything of that nature, like a sugar shine with some grain in it, yeah, I think it's worthwhile to clear that wash. Because you're going for something fairly clean. You want something fairly clean, for sure. So that's a little different category than what we're necessarily talking about here, and something to think about in a little bit of a different sort of light, if that makes any sense. So altogether, guys, great questions. Please keep them coming. bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, thealchemistcabinet.com, YouTube comments below, social media, etc. And make sure you pick up your copy of the Practical Distiller's Almanac, available now at thealchemistcabinet.com. Hope you guys are also enjoying the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast that I'm uploading to YouTube on this channel from time to time. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and I think that spirituality and distillation belong together. So hope you guys feel the same way. Have a great one. I'll catch you later. Love y'all. Bye.